spent tons of money. We just spent trillions of dollars and we don't have it. So we had to borrow that money. As we borrowed that money, then the Federal Reserve prints more money, and that money floods into the circulation and it devalues what we have. What does that mean? Higher prices. So when you go to the grocery store and you see the rising prices of vegetables, fruits, everything, and especially meat, it's because we spent too much money. We borrowed too much money.
President Biden is now announcing that the Senate is very close to passing a massive spending bill. Bernie Sanders is pushing Congress for another vote on a relief package, and Americans are currently experiencing financial difficulties right now, so a fourth stimulus check would definitely help many people across the nation. So we have very exciting news, and it's that President Biden just announced recently that Democrats are close to passing his spending bill, which will include many relief provisions for the people. Biden said during his speech that, "In my Build Back Better, we can lower prescription prices, and now we just have to get it through the U.S. Senate." During his speech, President Biden recognized that new federal data shows worsening inflation in January, but President Biden tried to turn it into a sales pitch for a spending bill, which would help buy families and seniors. The bill currently includes childcare and home health care, everybody. Biden said inflation is up, and it's up, but the fact is that if we're able to do the things that I'm talking about here, it will bring the cost for average families down. Biden claimed his bill is fully paid for with new taxes, and therefore is not going to worsen inflation. Everybody, it's important to remember that the Congressional Budget Office has said that the bill would add $367 billion in unfunded spending. The House passed the sprawling bill with a $2.2 trillion price tag back in November. And Manchin has criticized his fellow Senate Democrats of gimmicks that undercounted its true cost by making new programs. Inflation has tanked Biden's popularity. The White House has previously described inflation as transitory, while Biden himself claimed in December that the prior month's 6.8% annual inflation rate was likely to peak. Joe Biden also said in July that inflation was temporary, when it was around 5%. Joe Biden has already passed large stimulus bills. Biden's third stimulus bill, followed by partisan legislation in 2020, and that doled out about $4 trillion to keep the U.S. afloat. Now, Biden has signed in November a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and he argued it would ultimately lower inflation. Now, Bernie Sanders has also called on Senate Democrats to vote on legislation to lower the cost of prescriptions. Bernie Sanders says, "We're voting for an assistant secretary of something, and the American people are not staying up nights worrying about that. They're worried about prescriptions." Lowering prescription prices was a key part of the Democrats' agenda. So do you think it's going to get done, everybody? Tell me in the comments down below.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here. Mick, it's always good to see you, my friend. I'm glad you're here and glad you're doing what you're doing. You know, the premise of this hearing is absurd. I can't believe we're actually having a hearing to talk about doing away with the debt limit. You got to be kidding me. I mean, it's obvious the negative consequences of out of control spending and what they're having. Inflation is at a 40-year high right now. Do we realize that? A 40-year high. And instead of debating whether we should have a debt limit, we ought to be debating the real consequences that spending cuts should have on our debt ceiling. This is ridiculous. Our debt's not going away. Folks, I opened my small business on November 21st, 1988. I borrowed money for inventory. I borrowed money to get me started. I did not get a salary for 2 years, nothing whatsoever. I set out to retire my debt, and I did that. The first thing I did is I retired my debt. Then I retired my mortgage. I haven't owed anybody anything since 1994. This is ridiculous that we have this kind of debt in our country, and it's not sustainable. We've seen it happen over history, over time, what it's done to countries. You know, some people talk about Japan and their enormous debt to GDP ratio. Well, folks, look at Japan's GDP growth rate is abysmal. And similar things are happening right now in Italy. And some of you argue that the interest rates are lower than the growth rate and we can continue to roll over debt, borrowing new money to pay interest on old money. That is simply ridiculous. This is unsustainable. And who's going to be paying this? My children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren. This is intergenerational theft. We have got to stop this. And to debate stopping one of the only things that makes us even think about it has been pointed out here by Mr. Mulvaney and by others. The only time we think about this is when it come up against a debt limit. And Mr. Mulvaney is right. That's the only time we do anything about it. And it does result in good fiscal policy. It does. Mr. Mulvaney, I want to ask you, CBO has noted that rising debt will result in less private investment and lower output and outcome and a lower standard of living for Americans. In fact, their projections show that the long-term impact of debt rising to 200% of GDP, which is where we are headed with this budget, as it brings us to 117%, is a $9,000 annual income loss for Americans. A $9,000 annual income loss. Mr. Mulvaney, are you concerned that the massive growth in debt will crowd out other spending and result in negative economic impacts?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Carter. Thanks, buddy. It's good to see you. I think we're all familiar with the term. Honestly, I think you're seeing some of it now. You're already starting to see, I think one of the many reasons we're experiencing inflation is because the government has become so big. And yeah, I do worry about that in the near term and in the long term. This whole concept that, the debt ceiling is the problem is just befuddling to me. I heard Dr. Shiner mentioned that no good has come of it, but go down the list of all we've done in the past. I mentioned Graham Rudman. I mentioned the 1991 Act, the 2011 Act. Mr. McClintock did the whole list that goes back even further than that. Ask yourself this. What would you have done on fiscal policy if not for the debt ceiling? I mean, show me a couple of pieces of legislation dealing with reducing spending and getting the fiscal house in order that wasn't tied to the debt ceiling. And your point, Mr. Carter, is a good one. I wish my Democrat friends would see it from the same perspective, which is, yeah, it crowds out private sector spending, but it also crowds out other government spending. If you want money to spend on other government programs, it won't be there because it's going to go to pay down the debt. So even if we disagree about how government should spend money, I wish we could agree that we'd rather spend it on doing things than paying off debt in the past. And it worries me that people don't look at that side of it. The interest payments by themselves are getting ready to be the largest single line item in our budget outside of entitlements, and that's a problem.
Just real quick, Mick, I want to ask you one other thing. If we were to reverse our fiscal trajectory and put the federal budget on a sustainable course, what would be some of the positive economic effects?
I think you see less inflation. I think you see more private investment. One of the good things that came from our Tax Cuts Act was we encourage private investment, so you get growth without inflation. You got great growth right now, but you got it with inflation, which is sort of, running on a treadmill. So there's all sorts of benefits that come from spending more money in the private sector and spending less in the government sector.